Good morning, boys and girls. I hope you all had a great weekend. Here's my coffee cup for the day. And last week, my coffee cup was Bambi. All right. Well, first of all, I wanted to talk to you about giant pride. Our town has so much giant pride, and we could see that on Friday night when they lit up the town and the police cars and fire trucks and buses came around and waved to everybody. That was so awesome. And then we had it again on Sunday night when David Ryder came home from Afghanistan. The streets on Main Street were lined with people welcoming him home. And even though we're a small town, we might not have a whole lot of stores and things to do, but guess what? We sure have a lot of pride in our town and in our people in the town. So thank you for joining those great celebrations this past weekend. All right, back to Humphrey. Friendship according to Humphrey. Now we are on chapter 8, Ill Will. I returned to school with a great sense of accomplishment. But once I remembered where Og had spent the last 2 days, it was hard to concentrate on geography or math. I couldn't help imagining all the fun Og must have had with the Brisbanes. I glanced over at my neighbor in his glass tank. With that horrible grin on his face, he looked like a jack-o'-lantern. Scary. It was very, very, very cold outside, which meant that the heat inside was turned way, way up. Whew! That must be fine for a cold-blooded amphibian, but I was wishing I could take off my fur coat. Then the warm air woke up the crickets, who started singing, and there was a squeak, squeak, squeak that was not coming from me, but from Seth as he wiggled in his chair. It sounded like jingle bells. Squeak, squeak, squeak. Squeak, squeak, squeak. Squeak, 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 squeak. The squeaking made Gail giggle noisily, which made Mrs. Brisbane loudly shush her. I was looking forward to some peace and quiet during recess, knowing Og wouldn't want to chat. But when the time came, Mrs. Brisbane announced that the class would stay inside. She brought all kinds of interesting things to play with. I must admit, I wished I could get out of my cage and play along with the rest of the class. Art and Richie built a tall tower out of tiny block bricks, while Kirk and Seth worked on a jigsaw puzzle. AJ and Garth played a game where you slapped down cards. Heidi and Gail played another game, moving little plastic men around a board. Mandy, Sae, and Miranda came over to ask Tabitha to play with them. She didn't even look up. She just shook her head. I don't know why we even try to be friends with her, Mandy whispered to the other girls. Sae just sighed sadly. I knew how she felt. Og, can you hear me? I squeaked. I have something to ask you. I figured, even though I couldn't understand him, maybe he could understand me. See how much fun it is to play with your friends? I asked. It probably sounded like squeak, 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 but he could have at least responded with a boing. I decided to squeak up a little louder this time. I couldn't even hear myself because of all the yelling. Yelling? I looked around to see who was making all that noise. It wasn't Lower Your Voice AJ or Repeat It Please Richie. It was Gail. She had stopped giggling and started shouting. The person she was shouting at was her best friend Heidi. You cheated! I saw you, she yelled. I didn't, Heidi said. I wouldn't cheat. You must have. You always win. I'm never playing with you again, cheater, Gail shouted. Mrs. Brisbane quickly moved towards them. Girls, please. I didn't cheat, insisted Heidi. I'm not a cheater. Gail put her fingers in her ears. Did too. Cheater, cheater, cheater. Everyone else in the class stopped playing and stared at the two girls. Mrs. Brisbane was right between them now. Girls, please calm down and be quiet. Heidi and Gail were quiet, but they glared at each other angrily. "Tell me what happened, Gail," calmly. Gail wiped away some tears. She was supposed to move her man 5 spaces, and she moved it 6 spaces. That gave her a bonus jump, and she won. She cheated. "Did not," Heidi shouted. "I only went 5. The teacher held up both hands. "Stop. I want you two to cool off before we can talk about it. You're such good friends. Let's work this out." "She's not my friend anymore," said Gail. She was crying harder. "Thank goodness," Heidi shot back, "because I can't stand you, crybaby, cheater." Mrs. Brisbane shook her head. "Heidi, you go over there by Humphrey and Og," she said firmly. "Gail, you go sit at my desk. Try and settle down." The girls did as they were told. I think they were glad to get away from each other. Soon Heidi was leaning up against the table where Og and I have our homes. "Crybaby," she whispered so softly only we could hear her. It was hard for me to believe that Heidi would cheat her best friend. It was hard for me to believe that Gail would lie about Heidi. I thought friends always got along, no matter what. "First, all she does is giggle. Now, all she does is cry," Heidi muttered. At Mrs. Brisbane's desk, Gail glared over at Heidi and wiped away a few more tears. When recess was almost over, Mrs. Brisbane took the 2 girls out to the hall to discuss the argument. They came back in and quietly returned to their seats. But as soon as Mrs. Brisbane turned her back, I saw them stick their tongues out at each other. Maybe friendship wasn't all it was cracked up to be. It was snowing by afternoon recess, so Mrs. Brisbane divided the class into 4 teams. Each team had questions to answer. They had to decide as a group what the answer should be. Mrs. Brisbane kept score. She wisely put Heidi and Gail on different teams so they wouldn't argue or make fake faces, but their teams lost. Both their teams lost. The winning team had Miranda, Kirk, Seth, and Tabitha on it, and to my surprise, the reason they won was Tabitha.